The shovel bit into the packed earth of the cabin floor with a dull thud, a sound Elias had come to know better than his own heartbeat. It was a sound of dislocation, of deliberate upheaval in the one place that was supposed to be his foundation. Outside, the autumn air was turning brittle, snapping at the edges of the day with a promise of what was to come. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp soil and the fine dust that rose with every shovelful. Beside the growing pile of dirt sat Boro, a dog of indeterminate lineage and immense patience, his amber eyes tracking the rhythmic rise and fall of the tool. A low sigh escaped his chest, a puff of air that stirred the dust motes dancing in the slanted afternoon light. He rested his heavy head on his paws, a silent, furry witness to his master's strange obsession. The trench was 3 feet wide and nearly 8 feet long, running directly beneath the spot where Elias's simple rope bed had stood only a week before. Now the bed frame was leaned against the far wall, its mattress a lumpy island in a sea of domestic chaos. He worked with a quiet, focused economy of motion that belied his 19 years. His father had taught him that. Never waste a movement, never waste a breath. Energy was currency, the only kind that truly mattered when the world was stripped down to wood, stone, and winter. His shoulders and back ached with a deep, resonant fire, a pain so constant it had become a companion. Each scoop of earth was heavy, dense with the memory of the forest floor it had once been. He added it to the mound that now reached halfway to the low, beamed ceiling, a miniature mountain range in his 10 by 12-foot world. The sound of footsteps on the porch, heavy and certain, made him pause mid-swing. Boro's ears twitched, but he didn't lift his head. He knew the sound as well as Elias did. Mr. Gable didn't bother to knock. The door creaked open, flooding the dim cabin with the sharp, clear light of late October. Gable stood silhouetted in the doorway, a stout man with a fringe of white hair and a face weathered into a permanent state of disapproval. His eyes took a moment to adjust, then widened, first in confusion, then in outright disbelief. "In the name of all that's holy, what are you doing, boy?" His voice was a gravelly rumble that seemed to shake the very dust from the air. He stepped inside, his boots leaving clean prints on the otherwise disturbed floor. He circled the trench as if it were a fresh grave. "Are you burying someone? Did you finally go mad from the quiet out here?" Elias straightened up, resting his forearms on the handle of the shovel. His face was streaked with sweat and dirt. He met the older man's gaze without flinching. "I'm improving the cabin." Gable let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Improving it? You've dug a pit in your floor. That's not an improvement. That's an invitation for rats and cold. Wait until the ground freezes. That hole will suck every bit of warmth you make right out of here. You'll be an icicle by Christmas." He gestured with a thick, calloused thumb. "Your father, God rest his soul, built this place solid. He knew how to survive a winter. He wouldn't have dug a hole in his own floor." "This was his idea," Elias said, his voice quiet but firm. The words hung in the air, simple and direct. This gave Gable pause, but only for a moment. "His idea? Elias, your father was a good man, a fine carpenter, but he had notions, things he read in books. This looks like one of his notions. Notions don't keep you warm when the north wind is trying to blow your door down." He shook his head, a look of pity softening his features. "Fill it in, son. Stack your wood high, chink your walls, and get yourself another 2 blankets. That's how you beat the cold, not by digging to China." He turned to leave, then stopped at the door. "Martha's baking bread. She'll send a loaf over. A boy needs to eat proper food if he's going to do such foolish work." The door closed, leaving Elias once again in the dim quiet. He looked at the trench, then at the worn, leather-bound journal sitting on the small table by the window. It was his father's, filled with sketches, measurements, and thoughts written in a precise, elegant script. He'd read the entry 100 times. Hypocaustum. The Romans knew. Heat the mass, not the air. A river of warmth beneath the floor. Slow, steady, efficient. They will call it madness, but stone holds a memory of fire long after the flame is gone. Elias picked up the shovel. The ache in his back was a reminder of the work done and the work yet to do. Boro shifted, letting out another soft sigh, and closed his eyes. It would work. His father knew, and he would prove it. The days shortened, the sun's arc lowering toward the southern horizon. The work became a brutal, repetitive prayer. After digging the trench to a depth of 4 feet, Elias began the task of hauling stone. The creek was a quarter-mile away, its bed littered with the smooth, flat stones he needed, worn by centuries of flowing water. He built a crude sledge from scrap lumber and hauled it back and forth, Boro trotting faithfully at his side. Each trip was a battle against gravity and his own screaming muscles. He'd load the sledge until the runners groaned, then lean into the rope, his boots digging for purchase in the hardening ground. The weight was immense. His hands, already calloused from chopping wood, began to split and bleed. At night, he'd sit by the fire, soaking them in hot salt water, Boro resting his head on his knee, a warm and living comfort. He'd smear them with tallow and wrap them in rags, only to tear them open again the next morning. He hauled 217 stones, each one chosen for its flatness and integrity. He laid them out on the grass beside the cabin, a patient gray army awaiting his command. The townspeople, what few passed by on the rutted track that served as a road, would slow their wagons and stare. He heard the whispers when he went to the general store for flour and salt. The Miller boy's lost his mind. Digging his own grave, they say. Such a shame, after what happened to his folks. He ignored them. He bought his supplies, nodded to the storekeeper, and walked back to his patch of earth, his purpose a shield against their pity and their scorn. Lena was different. She arrived one afternoon while he was mixing clay and sand in a wooden trough, his hands and arms caked in the thick gray mud. She didn't stop at the edge of the property and stare. She walked right up to him, her steps quiet on the fallen leaves. She was the blacksmith's daughter, a year younger than him, with dark, curious eyes, and a way of moving that was both gentle and confident. She carried a small basket. "Mrs. Gable was worried you weren't eating," she said, her voice clear and calm. "She sent some stew." Elias stopped his work, wiping his muddy hands on a rag. He felt a flush of heat rise in his neck, unused to such direct and kind attention. "Thank you." She set the basket down and looked not at him, but at the trench. He had begun to line it, carefully fitting the flat stones together, mortaring them with the clay mixture. It was slow, painstaking work, like building a ship in a bottle. "Mr. Gable says you're making a root cellar." "No," Elias said. "Mayor Thompson said you were trying to dig a well from the inside out." "No." She knelt, her gaze tracing the clean lines of the stonework inside the trench. It was remarkably precise. "It's beautiful," she said, and he knew she meant it. She wasn't mocking him. She was seeing the work, the care. "What is it for?" He found himself wanting to explain, a feeling so foreign it was startling. He pointed to the opening at the base of the exterior wall, where he'd already started constructing a small, squat firebox from salvaged brick. "A fire goes in there," he said, his voice rough from disuse. He then pointed to the other end of the trench, where a narrow flue of stone rose against the opposite wall. The smoke and heat travel through the trench under the floor. It heats the stones. The stones heat the cabin. The smoke goes out the chimney. Lena looked from the firebox to the chimney, her brow furrowed in concentration. She saw the entire system in her mind. A slow smile spread across her face. It's a furnace under the floor. A hypocaust, he corrected, the word feeling strange and scholarly on his tongue. My father read about it. It's clever, she said, standing up. Will it work? Elias looked at his raw hands, at the pile of stones yet to be laid, at the darkening sky. He met her eyes. It has to. She nodded, a small, certain gesture. She didn't offer advice or doubt. She just accepted his answer. Well, she said, picking up her now empty basket, don't let the stew get cold. She walked away, leaving behind the scent of rosemary and the startling warmth of belief. Elias watched her go, then turned back to his work, the ache in his shoulders feeling just a little lighter than before. He finished lining the trench as the first snow flurries began to spin in the air, ghosting through the bare branches of the oaks. He then laid heavier, wider capstones over the top, fitting them together so tightly that a knife blade could not find a purchase between them. He sealed every seam with more clay mortar, his fingers growing numb in the cold. This would be his floor. This would be his hearth. On top of the capstones, he spread a thick layer of sand and then laid the final floorboards, cut from thick oak planks his father had left stacked behind the cabin. When he was done, the floor was solid, seamless, and slightly raised. The trench was gone, buried beneath layers of stone, sand, and wood. To any observer, the only signs of his weeks of labor were the small brick firebox outside the east wall and the slender stone chimney, no thicker than a man's arm, rising up the west. He moved his bed back into place, directly over the hidden stone channel. The cabin was tidy again, the mountain of earth having been used to bank the exterior walls for insulation. He stacked his firewood high beside the cabin and higher still next to the firebox. He spent a day cleaning and oiling his father's tools, putting them away in their proper places. He sat with Boro in the quiet, the silence of a finished thing, a waiting thing. The air in the cabin was frigid, his breath pluming in front of his face. The temperature had been dropping steadily for a week. The old-timers in town spoke of a winter the likes of which hadn't been seen in a generation. The squirrels had been frantic, the geese had left a month early, and the bark on the north side of the trees was thicker than anyone could remember. A sense of dread had settled over the valley, a cold weight that had nothing to do with the temperature. The day of the first true test arrived on a sheet of ice. The world was encased in a brittle, clear shell. Every branch, every blade of grass was a work of glass. Elias woke shivering under 3 heavy wool blankets. Boro was a tight, shivering ball at his feet. It was time. He pulled on his boots, his coat, and his hat, and went outside. The cold was a physical blow, stealing his breath. He knelt before the firebox, its brick mouth gaping and dark. He laid a bed of tinder, birch bark, and pine shavings, and on top of that, small, dry kindling. He struck a match, his fingers clumsy with cold, and shielded the tiny flame with his cupped hands. The tinder caught, a fragile orange flower in the vast gray cold. He fed it patiently, adding larger sticks, then small logs of seasoned oak. The fire grew, a hungry, crackling thing. He watched not the flames, but the flue. After a few minutes, a thin tendril of white smoke curled from the top of the small chimney on the other side of the cabin. It worked. The draft was pulling. He closed the heavy iron door of the firebox, leaving a small vent open at the bottom. The fire was now contained, its heat and smoke forced on their long, slow journey beneath his floor. He went back inside. For an hour, nothing changed. The cabin remained bitterly cold. He could feel the doubt creeping in, a cold more piercing than the frost on the windows. Had Gable been right? Was it just a notion from a book? Boro whined softly, nudging his hand. Elias sat on the edge of the bed, his hope dwindling with the fading light. And then he felt it. Not a blast of heat, but a subtle, pervasive change. A deep, resonant warmth rising from the floorboards beneath his feet. It was the kind of warmth you feel from a sun-baked stone on a summer afternoon. He placed his bare palm on the wood. It was warm to the touch. Boro, sensing the change, stretched out, no longer curled in a ball, and laid his body full length on the floor, emitting a groan of pure animal contentment. Elias moved his hand across the planks. The entire area above the trench was a wide, gentle radiator. The warmth wasn't in the air, not yet. It was in the mass. Heat the mass, not the air. Slowly, over the next few hours, the stone and wood released their borrowed heat into the small room. The chill receded, pushed back not by a draft of hot air, but by a quiet, radiant energy. The frost on the window panes began to melt from the bottom up. Elias took off his coat, then his sweater. The air became comfortable, then warm. By nightfall, he was in his shirt sleeves. He sat in his chair, the cabin glowing with the soft light of a single lamp, and felt a profound sense of peace. He had not just built a furnace, he had built a fortress. He had honored his father. He had proven him right. That night, for the first time since September, he slept on top of his bed, with no blankets at all, while the world outside froze solid. Boro slept on the floor beside him, his flank pressed against the warm wood, dreaming his dog dreams in a pocket of impossible summer. The storm did not arrive. It fell. It was as if the sky, heavy and gray for days, simply gave up and collapsed upon the valley. It started as thick, wet snow, but as the temperature plunged, it turned to a fine, wind-driven powder that insinuated itself through every crack and keyhole. The wind came from the north, a solid wall of sound and force that screamed through the pines and shook the cabins to their foundations. For 3 days it did not stop. The world beyond Elias's window disappeared, replaced by a roiling, hypnotic vortex of white. Snow piled up in drifts that buried fences, then windows, then porches. The sun was a forgotten memory. Inside, Elias's world remained an island of calm. He kept the firebox fed with a steady supply of oak, going out every 4 hours to reload it. The journey of 20 feet from his door to the firebox was a brutal ordeal. He had to tie a rope from the doorknob to the corner of the firebox just to keep his bearings in the blinding chaos. The wind tore at him, and the cold was so intense it felt like a burn. But each time he returned, stumbling back inside, covered in snow, the cabin welcomed him with its deep, steady warmth. The floor was a constant, comforting presence, a tamed piece of the earth's core. Boro would greet him with a low wag of his tail, then retreat to his favorite spot on the floor. Elias would sit, his heart pounding, and slowly feel the life seep back into his frozen fingers and face. He ate stew. He read his father's books. He waited. He was not afraid. He was prepared. On the 4th day, the wind lessened, though the snow still fell thick and silent. It was then that he heard the sound, a desperate, muffled pounding on his door. Boro started up, a low growl in his chest. Elias quieted him with a hand. He opened the door to a wall of snow. A figure was slumped against it, a ghost caked in white. It was Mr. Gable. He was barely recognizable, his face a mask of ice, his lips blue. "Elias," he croaked, his voice a dry rasp. "Help us. Martha, she's so cold." "Our fire. The chimney's blocked. We've burned the last of the furniture." Elias didn't speak. He pulled the man inside, propping him up, and then took his shovel and began to dig a tunnel out from his door. It took him nearly an hour to clear a path to the Gable cabin, a mere 50 yards away. He found Martha huddled under a pile of every blanket and coat they owned, her breathing shallow. The air in their home was arctic, colder than the air outside. He helped Gable carry her back to his cabin. The moment they entered, the change was staggering. The Gables stopped, staring. The air was warm, not with the dry, scorching heat of a wood stove, but with a gentle, ambient heat that felt like life itself. They looked at Elias, then at the floor, then at the single, blanketless bed. Comprehension dawned slowly on Mr. Gable's face, followed by a wave of shame so profound it seemed to bow his shoulders. Elias settled Martha on his bed, covering her with a single quilt more for comfort than for need. He gave them hot broth. They drank it, their hands shaking. They didn't speak for a long time. They just absorbed the warmth, letting it penetrate their frozen bones. "How?" Mr. Gable finally whispered, his eyes on the floorboards. "The trench," Elias said simply. The older man shook his head slowly, not in disbelief, but in wonder. He looked at Elias, his eyes watery. "All that work. We all laughed. I called you a fool." "You were cold," Elias said. It was not an accusation, just a statement of fact. By evening, others came. First, Mayor Thompson, his family in tow, their grand house on the hill now a frozen tomb. Then, the blacksmith's family. Lena arrived, her face pale, but her eyes full of a fierce, quiet pride as she looked at Elias. His small cabin, once the subject of ridicule, had become an ark. 12 people found refuge there that night, sleeping side by side on the miraculously warm floor. They shared what little food they had brought, and Elias shared all that he had. There was no panic, no hysteria, just a quiet, humbled gratitude and the pervasive, life-giving warmth that rose from the stones his father had dreamed of and his own 2 hands had laid. They listened to the wind howl its last dying breaths outside, safe in the house built on a river of fire. When the storm finally broke, the valley was a new and alien landscape. The snow was 15 feet deep in places, a soft white blanket that had smothered the world. The silence was absolute. For 2 weeks the community remained isolated, but together in Elias's cabin. The men organized digging parties, clearing paths between houses, checking on livestock, and clearing the massive drifts from roofs before they collapsed. The women organized the food, cared for the children, and kept the cabin in order. Elias, in his quiet way, was the center of it all. He kept the firebox fed, the source of their collective survival. He spoke little, but when he did, people listened. He was no longer the foolish, grieving boy. He was the man who had listened to the wisdom of the past. The day the thaw began, Mr. Gable approached Elias as he was splitting wood. The older man stood for a moment, watching the axe fall true every time. "I was wrong, son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I was wrong about everything. Your father, he would be so proud of you." Elias stopped, resting the axe head on the chopping block. He simply nodded. It was all the acceptance that was needed. That spring, a new kind of work began in the valley. The first person to come to Elias was Mayor Thompson. He did not command or request. He asked. "Will you show me?" he said, his hat in his hands. I don't want my family to ever be that cold again." Elias agreed. Together, they dug a trench in the mayor's floor. Then the blacksmith came, and Lena worked alongside her father and Elias, learning the craft of stone and clay. Then came Mr. Gable, who proved to be a meticulous and tireless worker. That summer, and for the next 3, Elias went from cabin to cabin, from farmhouse to farmhouse. He taught them how to find the right stones, how to mix the mortar, how to build the firebox for the cleanest draw. He shared his father's journal, the elegant script and precise drawings becoming a blueprint for the valley's survival. The Miller floor became the standard. New houses were built with the system integrated from the start. The mockery of the town had transformed into a doctrine of safety. They were no longer just a collection of families living in a valley. They were a community, bound together by a shared memory of a terrible cold and the shared knowledge of how to defeat it. Elias and Lena married 2 summers after the Great Storm. They did not build a new house. They lived in the small cabin, the first and most perfect of its kind. Their life was quiet and full. They had 2 children, a son and a daughter, who grew up knowing the comforting warmth of the floor as a simple fact of life, like sunshine or rain. They played on the floorboards in the depths of winter, warm and safe, unaware of the revolution that lay buried just inches beneath them. Years passed like the turning of seasons, each one marked by the first lighting of the trench fire in the fall and its final embers dying out in the spring. The world outside changed. A proper road was built through the valley. New people came, bringing new ideas. But the story of the Great Storm and the Miller floor became a local legend, a foundational myth told to children on cold winter nights. Elias became an elder, his hair turning the color of winter frost, his hands gnarled but still strong. He remained a man of few words, his wisdom measured out in patient action rather than long speeches. He was respected. He was loved. Boro grew old. His muzzle turned white and his amber eyes clouded over. His steps became slow and deliberate. He spent most of his days sleeping on the floor, in the exact spot he had claimed that very first day the warmth had risen from the stones. One winter morning, he did not wake up. He had passed peacefully in his sleep, his old body curled on his bed of perpetual warmth. Elias carried him, his weight surprisingly light, to the base of a great oak tree on the hill overlooking the cabin. He dug a grave in the cold ground, the familiar rhythm of the shovel a comfort and a sorrow. He buried his faithful companion, the first and truest believer, and placed a simple, flat creek stone to mark the spot. He did not weep, but a great silence settled in the cabin that was never quite filled again. Lena passed a decade later, her hand in his, the warmth of the floor a final comfort to her. Elias lived on, a quiet patriarch of the valley he had saved. His children had children of their own, and they would come to the small cabin and listen to their grandfather's stories, though he rarely spoke of his own accomplishments. He spoke of the Romans. He spoke of his father's books. He spoke of the patience of stone. On his 90th birthday, the entire valley gathered at his cabin. They brought food and gifts, and they sat with him, sharing stories. Mr. Gable's grandson, now the mayor, stood and raised a glass. "To Elias Miller," he said, his voice ringing with sincerity, "the man who kept us warm." Elias passed away that spring, as the last fire in the trench was dying down to embers. He died in the bed that sat above the warm stones, the same bed he had slept in without blankets on that first night of triumph so many years ago. They buried him on the hill, next to Lena and next to Boro, under the shade of the great oak. The town commissioned a new headstone for him, carved from the finest granite. It was simple, just as he had been. It read, "Elias Miller, he kept us warm." Decades later, a young family, new to the valley, bought the old Miller cabin. It had been lovingly maintained, a historical landmark of sorts. The children, a boy and a girl, were fascinated by the strange brick box outside the wall. "What is it, Papa?" the little girl asked. Her father knelt, placing a hand on the cool brick. "This," he said, his voice full of reverence, "is where the warmth begins." That evening, as the first chill of autumn settled in the air, he went outside and built a small, careful fire in the box, just as the instructions passed down through the town's historical society had described. He went inside and waited with his family. After an hour, his daughter, who was lying on the floor drawing, looked up with wide eyes. "Papa," she whispered, her small hand pressed flat against the old oak planks. "The floor is waking up." Her father smiled. He looked around the small, simple room, at the solid beams and the sturdy walls. He felt the deep, gentle heat begin to rise, a silent testament to a quiet man, a faithful dog, and an idea from a book that had become a valley's salvation. The legacy was not just in the story, but in the stones themselves, still holding the memory of fire, still keeping the promise of warmth against the coming cold.